We've heard many stories of Oni over the past few months, and while this is, unfortunately, the last one, at least as far as I can see in the near future, this Oni is arguably the most powerful one we've seen. And yet, the moral of the story is that sometimes, the only thing you need to do to protect yourself from evil is to fight back. Even if it's just a little bit. Yo koso owashitare, and welcome back to yet another classical Japanese folktale. If you like Japanese history or Japanese culture or just storytelling in general, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel because there are still plenty more of these stories. Again, we are going to be done with Oni stories for a while, but there are still plenty more scary stories about ghosts and spirits, and then even after we're done with the scary stories, there are still more stories to come yet. So there's plenty of stories. So please subscribe, and with all of that out of the way, let's just get into the actual story, our final demon story, final Oni story. Once upon a time, imawa mukashi. In an unnamed district, the writing in the original manuscript is illegible, in the province of Harima, someone died. Who this person is, what their position in society was, how they died, all of these details that these stories typically want us to know, go unmentioned here. But what we do know is that he, or possibly she, but most likely he, was part of a much larger noble house. For those new to this channel at this time in Japanese history, a nobleman's family weren't the only people who lived in his house. Noble houses had a whole host of servants and workers who kept everything running properly, and essentially the whole place, the whole estate functioned like one small economy, with everyone doing their own bit to keep the larger system functioning properly. Big estates don't upkeep themselves, after all, and the aristocratic owners of the house were certainly not going to be the ones to see to all of the daily chores of the place. They were far too busy writing poetry, looking at paintings, or just sitting on the veranda wistfully gazing at the gardens, stewing in excessive boredom, and finding ever more creative and stirring ways to whine about how miserable they were. Far too busy to maintain their own houses, after all. That might be a little unfair of me to go at them like that, but anyway, this unnamed person who died belonged to one of these big houses in the province, as mentioned, Harima. Now, dying in ancient Japan was kind of a big deal, not just because, someone died, but because the ancient Japanese had a whole set of beliefs about ritual defilement and the spirits of the dead that meant that they couldn't just bury the dude and then just be done with it. No, they needed to call in a professional who dealt with spirits and ritual purification to take care of all the little rites and practices that they believed were necessary to ensure that no further misfortune occurred. They needed an onmyoji, which is essentially an ancient Japanese wizard, who is in charge of handling all sorts of things that, as mentioned before, with like ritual purification and death and things like that, along with other things like reading the stars and just predicting the future, and a whole bunch, again, Japanese wizard is basically what they were. And so, the lord of this estate had one of these onmyoji come to the property and do all of those things that they needed him to do. And given how easily people died back in the day, this was probably a pretty standard thing. Nothing really worth mentioning under normal circumstances. After the onmyoji showed up, he immediately set about doing whatever it was that he needed to do, and actually ended up spending a lot of time inside the house proper as opposed to being out in the garden, which, assuming this estate was constructed the way most of them were, was probably what took up the majority of the property's space. Now, he spent a good long while cooped up inside, taking readings, casting spells, just working all sorts of ancient Japanese mojo. Everything was proceeding pretty much as normal, until something happened that made the onmyoji stop what he was doing and pay very close attention. We don't know exactly what it was that he saw, but his face suddenly turned very, very grave, and he left what he was doing to seek out some of the people of the house who were in something of a managerial position and, in a very serious voice, gave them a message. Over the course of being here, I've actually seen certain omens that you need to know about. In just a few days, an Oni will likely show up at this estate. You and everyone else in this house should take extreme caution on that day. Now, this was not the kind of prediction that an onmyoji would make willy-nilly. a few of the previous stories we've heard also featured these kinds of predictions, and things didn't turn out well for those who disregarded them. And given how important one's reputation was in ancient Japanese Heian society, an onmyoji who had a habit of making very serious predictions that turned out to be nothing more than hot air probably wouldn't have been patronized by the nobility for very long. As a result, the people of this house had complete faith that the onmyoji was telling the truth, and they weren't about to tempt fate and write off such a grave warning as mystical mumbo-jumbo. Onmyoji were professionals, and they had no reason to believe that this guy was trying to pull a fast one on them. So, after hearing this very grave warning, the people of the house all grew very concerned and asked this onmyoji what specifically they should do about this approaching oni threat. The onmyoji told them, on the day that it will happen, you should all undertake monoimi. Monoimi being a special kind of ritual seclusion. Now, monoimi was a practice that, as far as I can see, actually was grounded in some sensible logic surrounding disease, which the ancient Japanese believed was caused by bad spirits and just general misfortune or bad juju, if you'll forgive the dense academic jargon. Perhaps the most notable part of conducting monoimi was that the gates to whatever house was observing it would be shut, and no one would be allowed in or out. The people in the designated area would also engage in various acts of purification, like fasting, ritual bathing, practices which, despite clearly not being grounded in modern science and medicine, still kind of made a lot of sense considering how much they didn't know about how disease and things like that actually worked. If you are infected with something, quarantining yourself off and making sure that you keep up on your hygiene are both very good things to do. And that is precisely what the onmyoji meant when he made this suggestion. Lock the place down, abstain from ritualistically impure things, and engage in ritualistically purifying things, and hopefully that will be enough to deter any baleful entities that might try to cause problems. And the members of the house, again, trusting that this guy was a professional, were more than willing to comply. Now, the day of dread wasn't that far away. So while this onmyoji probably didn't live with these people on the regular, there was no sense in him returning to wherever he came from, and instead, he just hung around promising to help deal with the problem the day of, and in all likelihood get some kind of a reward for his efforts. So, after spending a few days just kind of hanging out at this place, soon enough, the day came. And all morning long, everyone in the house undertook the necessary precautions at the onmyoji's direction. Over the course of their work, though, some of the denizens of the house came to the onmyoji and asked him where this oni was going to come from and what appearance it would take. I mean, sensible questions. Of course, you would want to know what specifically to look out for and where to look out for it. The onmyoji told them, this oni, this demon, will come in the form of a man and will arrive at the gate. Unlike others of his kind, this oni doesn't creep through back doors or engage in the cowardly kind of evil that most of them do. This oni, instead, does most of its dealings in a proper way and has a certain sense of dignity that the rest lack, because this oni is not just your average demon. This is an onigami. Now, an onigami, or kishin, depending on how you read this word, is made up of these two characters. The first one being oni, which means demon or spirit. It's an oni. And the second one comes from kami, which means God. So basically, this is an oni so powerful that it rivaled the very gods in ability. Which, to be fair, there were all kinds of gods, and not all of them were super, super powerful. But, judging by the way that this onmyoji was talking about it, it's very clear that this was a creature in a completely different league to its other inferior kin. Of course, hearing this news terrified the people of the house, who then redoubled their efforts to lock things down and even stuck a bunch of sealing charms on the gate and cut down a peach tree and used it to further block off the gate. Apparently, peach trees and their fruit were believed to have some sort of evil dispelling, evil cleansing powers of some kind. There was also some kind of extra rite of some kind that they performed, but the character explaining what it is illegible, so we can't be sure exactly what they did, but it was probably some kind of a Buddhist spell of protection. Pretty much, these guys were not taking any chances. If this Oni was as powerful as the Onmyoji was suggesting, then they could not afford to spare any expense in protecting themselves. After everything was ready, they waited. We can't be sure how long it was, but soon, the Onmyoji told the denizens of the house that the hour for this thing to show up had arrived. A few of the men, along with the Onmyoji, went to the gate and peered out of a small open space specifically made for checking to see who was at the gate. And right there, standing just a few yards away from the gate doors, which the gate doors again were sealed by magical seals and a big peach tree, was a man. He was dressed in plain everyday clothes, a suikam and some hakama pants, but he also had one of those conical-shaped umbrella hats that was hanging off the back of his neck. A fairly normal-looking man, all things considered, except for one thing. He was just standing there, staring with unblinking eyes at the gate. The Onmyoji then told the men around him in a very low voice, "That's it. That's the Oni." It was all they could do to not break out into sheer panic. If you remember from previous stories, most Oni only started moving around after dark and tended to rely on the element of surprise to catch their human prey. But this Oni, this one was apparently so strong and so confident in its abilities that it was just standing there, out in the open in the middle of the day. It wasn't skulking in the shadows or trying to lure people out of the safety of the house to devour them in secret by turning into a beautiful woman. It was out in the open, seemingly defying anyone to try and stop it. The Onmyoji had even said that it had something like a certain sense of propriety, which was why it had waltzed right on up to the front gate, having actually followed the proper path, an indication that it considered itself superior to its baser kin. It was following the rules. It knew the rules of propriety. It knew how things were supposed to be done, and it was saying that I am not a lesser being. I am somebody who understands how things are done. I am it, is basically what he's saying. The men of the house and the Onmyoji watched this Oni, wide-eyed, for several minutes, as it just stood there, again, not moving a muscle, and just continued to stare at the gate, almost like it was contemplating what to do next. As powerful as it was, it seemed like their preparations were having some kind of an effect. I mean, clearly, the Oni seemed to be stuck in its tracks. But although their seclusion efforts seemed to be effective, the men weren't quite confident enough to just go about their business and pretend like nothing was happening. No. They were staring down a creature that deserved every bit of caution they could muster, and they weren't going to take their eyes off of it for a second. That is, of course, until they blinked and it was suddenly gone. Yeah, in a fraction of a second, it just disappeared. Right in front of them, just poof, gone. Okay, so Oni could disappear. That's not new. If you've been listening to the previous stories, again, that's pretty normal, but where did it disappear to? Was the whole ordeal over? Had it just given up? For a brief moment, there was a ray of hopeful optimism that sprang up in everyone's mind, until they heard a scream come from deeper inside the house. They all whipped around to see everyone clearly scared out of their minds, trembling, stumbling, and falling backwards in terror. The men at the gate followed everybody else's gaze toward what they were looking at, only to see, sitting there in front of a big outdoor stove like it owned the place, was the Oni. The same guy, the same suikan hakama combination, the same conical-shaped hat hanging down off of his neck, the same guy they had just seen outside the gate. Panic broke out, and everybody inside just scattered, running this way and that, some heading indoors, some making for the gate, but everyone trying to get away. But the problem was, they had locked down all of the exits thinking to keep this horrible thing out. But now, they were locked in here with it. There was no escape. This demon was powerful enough that even the most intense lockdown and anti-demon measures had meant nothing. It had just teleported in or something like that. And amidst all of this panic were some voices shouting that this was it was all over. And those hearing these words couldn't help but believe them, and all of the courage and sense of rationality that anybody had had up to this point evaporated in an instant. But there was one young man in the house, the son of the lord of the estate, who decided to do something a little different. Now, he was of the same mind as everyone else in that he believed that they were all toast. there really wasn't any way out of the situation. He was going to get devoured alongside everybody else. But he thought to himself, if he was going to die anyway, he might as well go out swinging. And if, in the 1 in a million chance, there happened to be any survivors after all of this, they could pass down his deeds of bravery for generations to come, and at least his death wouldn't be completely pointless. Now, the chances of even that happening were slim, obviously, and he doubted any of them were going to make it out alive, but what did he have to lose? So, filled with a fire of fatalistic determination, this young man darted to a place where he had a bow and arrow stored away. I don't know why he had these stored away previously, but I guess he just wanted to keep his bow and arrows close. He pulled them out, strung the bow, grabbed a handful of arrows, and headed to a place where he had a line of sight on the Oni, which was still just sitting there, menacingly. Why it wasn't attacking anybody was anybody's guess. Maybe it was drinking in the atmosphere of pure panic, maybe it was just enjoying the show, as it were, before digging in. But as soon as this Oni was in range, the young lord knocked a particularly large arrow into the bow, pulled back the string as far and as strongly as he could, pointed it at the Oni, and let the arrow fly. It sped through the air with a quick and powerful whoosh, and then struck the Oni right in the center of mass. But this is where things get really weird, because as soon as this Oni was hit, it sprang to its feet and then took off sprinting. But instead of tearing after the man who had dared shoot it in a vengeful fury, it went in a direction where there wasn't anyone. And just as it had done out in the front of the gate, it vanished into thin air in a split second. The arrow, meanwhile, when it had struck the Oni, had bounced off of its torso without actually piercing any flesh. It seemingly had had zero effect, and yet, it apparently was enough to scare this incredibly powerful being into flight? That didn't make any sense. But for all appearances, the threat was now gone. And after a moment of calm, it didn't seem like the Oni had disappeared only to reappear somewhere else and then attack. Everyone started coming around to the idea that they were, indeed, safe. A few of the men then turned to this young man who had shot the demon and said, "That was incredible, my lord." The young lord, though seemingly embarrassed by this sudden praise, tried to excuse it by just saying, It wasn't that crazy. I just figured that since we were all going to die anyway, I might as well do something that people would remember me for, and gave it a shot. The Onmyoji, though, the wizard who had been directing the whole thing, however, was far more shocked than anyone else. In all of his years of studying spirits and demons and how to deal with them, he probably had never heard of an Oni being repelled by shooting it with a regular bow and arrow. There were some ritualistic bows and arrows that you could do to shoot at baleful influences to get them to go away, but this was just a regular bow and arrow shot by a regular dude. Furthermore, he knew better than most people how powerful that particular Oni was, and couldn't believe that it had run away with its tail between its legs because one guy stood up to it. That was unheard of. But from that day forth, that house had no more Oni problems. And that is actually the end of the story proper, but, of course, we have a little bit of commentary by the writer at the end. The text says that maybe it was because of the great lengths that the Onmyoji went to try and make the place as Oni-proof as possible, but everything about this story, from the way the monster somehow got inside the house while being outside the gate without anyone seeing it do so, to the way that the arrow just impotently bounced off of it, yet managed to scare it away, this was all just really, really weird. And both the Onmyoji and the young lord who shot the Oni were indeed quite remarkable people. And thus is it said that an Oni with the capability of transforming into a human, and so brazenly walking out in the open in the middle of the day for all to see, is an incredibly rare and terrifying thing. And that is the full end of the story. So, if you did enjoy that story, please don't forget to give the video a like. Please subscribe to the channel because, again, there are still plenty more stories where this one came from, even though this is the final Oni story, at least for the time being. And feel free to share with friends, family, people who are interested in Japanese culture, or who just need something to put on in the background while they do wash the dishes or something, or are stuck in traffic. That's how I consume most of my YouTube anyway. So, if you have been watching all the way up to the end here, I do thank you sincerely. Ito ureshiu koso hamerikere. And hopefully, we will see you next week for, of course, another story. that on the one hand is pretty spooky. It is a scary story. But on the other, it's actually quite heartbreaking, and honestly, I'm going to probably gush about it a bit because I actually find it quite emotionally impactful, and I'm actually a sucker for those kinds of like really stirring stories. But again, it is a scary story. So look forward to that. But that's going to be it. Thanks guys. We'll catch you later. Goodbye.